Welcome everybody, and thank you for watching our next installment of interviews from APPF. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Fanie du Toit with us today. Fanie du Toit actually has bilateral cochlear implants and copes really well in most, if not all, environments. But Fanie represents the NCPD, and that's with the National Council of Persons with Disability. And he's been educating me as a professional on how to go about reporting on a functional impairment. So functional report writing in terms of specifically audiology, and understanding that the way we write reports in a clinical way are very, very different from the way we write a functional report. And a functional report, is how I have understood it, is so much more than what the audiogram is. So we don't really talk about the decibels and the frequencies and the audiogram in terms of the graph, but we look at the person in a holistic way. We look at how they're able to function in their work environment, academic environment, family environment, communicative environment, and how that invisible impairment, or that hearing loss in this case, affects a person functionally in their entire life. So being able to educate employers on what one can expect, and educating employees as well as to how to advocate for themselves and what the correct channels and methods of communication would be in order for the people who do not have hearing loss can understand how it impacts them on an everyday life. So without further ado, I would really like to introduce Fanie to the conversation today, and start with just asking you the first question that comes to mind, and what was really important for me, that really let the penny sort of sink, is what is the difference between a functional report versus an audiological report?
Thank you so much, Scara, for this wonderful opportunity to share our ideas from the National Council of and for Persons with Disabilities in South Africa. From our perspective, what health professionals and all the other role players should know is that inclusion or dialogue, mediation, even litigation in practice are impossible with a clinical reporting which only describes the clinical loss and recommends, for example, hearing devices and technologies as management. Health professionals, as well as the other role players involved, must understand, for example, the relationship between impairment, disability, and reasonable accommodation. And the reporting must comply with the content of disability rights issues. Now, as mentioned, typically, reports are clinical descriptions, usually only interpretable by other medical professionals in the same field of speciality. This is not language used or understood by employers, for example, HR managers, insurance companies, etc., as well as our persons with impairments and our families, who are an integral part of negotiating for their own reasonable accommodation on various levels. Now, a clinical report normally does not quote or reflect any information specified in any of the official language and legal documents on reasonable accommodation of persons with impairments, and is therefore of little or no value to either the individual or other applicable stakeholders. The audiogram, for example, provided as evidence of hearing impairment or hearing disability is actually uninterpretable, inadequate, and not useful in the motivation to determine disabling conditions and therefore reasonable accommodation. It says nothing about the actual loss, the impact of the loss, the disablement experience, or the reasonable accommodation required. So what we must remember is that reasonable accommodations are, or persons with disabilities or persons with a hearing disability, is persons focused, is situation focused. No one size fits all approach. And that one size fits all approach is not in line with legislation. So when health professional only recommends, for example, amplification for a person with a hearing impairment, it applies to the responsibility of that specific individual, but does not speak to the responsibility of, or for example, the employer as per legislation. This is very important for all role players to understand that. These role players in society require a report that states whether the person can be considered a person with a disability, and that is what we are all working towards. But any report that uses only a clinical description, as you mentioned, as proof of disability, without describing the impact of the impairment and the functional limitations, because that is what's about, is functional limitations, cannot be used to form an opinion on whether a person is a person who has a disability. So the question how professionals may, for example, use our protocol that we've developed and guideline to help them to identify the functional needs for an adult who is therefore hearing impaired. And that is also important. We focus on adults with a hearing impairment. Now, for this accommodations and report purposes, we need a comprehensive case history, not medical, but functional. The recommendations for reasonable accommodation have to be backed up by South African law on the rights of persons with disabilities. And then lastly, to answer your question, it's also a myth that functional reporting or functional reports are only applicable for the workplace. Any adult with hearing loss and their families are entitled to a functional report or functional reporting based on the needs and the merits of a specific case. So we can be able to see now a link on the screen on our video, the protocol for identifying the functional needs and the reasonable accommodation of a deaf or hearing impaired adult. And that's in fact is what functional reporting is all about.
It sounds so obvious when you say that. And I think, you know, even speaking from my experience as an audiologist in report writing, that functional reporting should be the rule and not the exception. But I think at the moment it is the exception. So can you maybe just unpack a little bit more for us? What is functional case history? What is a functional disability?
So what is a functional disability? Firstly, all role players, the health professionals, human rights experts, disability rights experts involved must understand what is impairment first. Impairment is a perceived or actual feature in a person's body or functioning that may result in a limitation or loss of activity or restricted participation, like in my case, a person with a cochlear implant with profound hearing loss, with a person in society. Furthermore, the United Nations Convention signed by South Africa, as well as our national disability policy, so-called the white paper on the rights of persons with disabilities, do not attempt to define the concept. Disability is imposed by society when a person with a physical, intellectual, neurological, or in our case, a sensory impairment is denied access to full participation in all aspects of life. This is what disability is, and how disability happens when that society fails to uphold the rights and the specific needs of individuals with impairments. So getting back to the question, we can say the criterion impairment. That means the use of assistive technology, devices, or modifications or adjustment is in fact disabling. That means, for example, a mild hearing loss can be a moderate functional limitation. Now, the registered health professional in the field of hearing loss must certify if a person has a disabling hearing loss after impairment is clearly explained in chapters 5 and 6 of the technical assistance guidelines on the employment for persons with disabilities, for example. But also important, the functional disability is also explained in the criteria in the Social Assistance Act, is also explained in the Employment Equity Act and the Income Tax Act, and all have different functional definitions. And that's what the people must understand, the role plays, that there's no clear-cut disability definition. There is different functional definitions, and we must empower ourselves and familiarize ourselves with the different legislation, because we write functional reports for different purposes. Generally speaking, in South Africa, there's a definition for disability as explained by the United Nations Convention that we must apply in South Africa. I mentioned to you the Social Assistance Act of 2001. So we as the practitioners must be aware what is a definition and how the differences in definitions work. The Social Assistance Act, for example, referred to a moderate to severe limitation of a person's ability. The Employment Equity Act, people must have a long-term recurring or physical or mental impairment which substantially limits their prospects of entry into an advancement in employment. So it's a different approach. And then the Tax Incomes Act has also a different definition. And if we do report writing, functional reporting on a functional disability, we as the professionals must make sure that we understand the purpose of our reporting.
Can I ask you, who is required to write a functional report? Is it only the audiologist, or is it the managing physician, the ENT? Who's required to write that report on behalf of the hearing impaired person?
Functional reporting, from our perspective, is a holistic approach that involves various stakeholders, such as the person with a specific impairment, in our case, the hearing impairment, the applicable health professional, a disability rights expert, a labor relations officer or supervisor from a specific institution, or the HR manager, depending on the situation. The reality is that one person alone does not have the background and skills to write a proper functional report. A holistic approach must be followed. All stakeholders must familiarize themselves with the functional impact of a specific impairment, in our case, a hearing impairment, as well as the disability rights of the individual, in order to make the right decision regarding the reasonable accommodation. If it's for wrong purposes, then it's different definition, as explained earlier. If it's for workplace, there's a different disability definition. But who's responsible? The reality is that the medical professionals are not necessarily trained in the details of legislative issues, and therefore they may legally involve experts in disability rights in the process of functional reporting. Now, these experts will give support regarding, say, for example, additional accommodations needed to ensure that proposals made in a functional report are in line with disability legislation. It's the issue of together we are strong, together we can make an impact. In this way, all recommendations are factual then, and it's based on recognized documented law. Now, this type of functional reporting will pave the way to a much better understanding on all sides, from the employer side or the person that deal with disability grants, and what is that the person with a hearing impairment needs, and what the society can do to relieve any disabilities caused. And as I mentioned earlier, disability is imposed by society on a person with an impairment. Disability is not within the person. We, as persons with hearing loss, are persons with impairments, being disabled by society due to an inaccessible environment. Our training that I referred to earlier gives important background on how to identify the functional needs. So it's a team effort that we can work together to include persons with hearing loss better in society, to give us a fair chance of equal access.
Fanie, that's really good. I know that the IDA Institute, they always place a high value on getting past, just explaining about the audiogram, get to the functional, implication of a person with hearing loss. Can you tell us a bit more about the NCPD, but then also your affiliation and relationship with the IDA Institute, but also your recent affiliation with APPF?
That is a wonderful process that we're busy with. I think NCPD, for us, it's all about equity, inclusion, and support by means of equal access to rehabilitation and habilitation, with the aim of enabling us as persons with hearing loss to reach and maintain our optimal sensory and social functional levels. Thus providing us with the tools, and that is the important thing, the tools to change our lives towards a higher level of independence. And this is where relationships, networks comes in. So promoting these concepts that I explained earlier and implement this in practice as partners, working closely together, we can provide or restore functions, like in my case, the cochlear implant, or compensate for loss. I must understand the reality of my impairment. I cannot function on this platform without a neck loop or a mini mic. To restore the functions, or make provision for the absence of a functional limitation so that we can be included on an equal basis. But that can only be done if we work together. And this, as partners, that partnership, like you mentioned, is very precious. And I think it's a dream come true for me.
Thank you, Fanie. We are also so excited about our relationship with NCPD, and also very much excited about our relationship and growing relationship with IDA Institute. It's only going to help skill audiologists and educate them, and us, shall I say, in how we look at hearing loss. It's not just, we spoke about widgets the other day. It's not just the widget that we fit on the ear. It's not just the hearing test. It is so much more. So we are also very, very excited to learn so much from you, because we have already, and we're excited to let our relationship grow and nurture. I wanted to ask you, what currently are NCPD's main concerns and challenges?
I think it's information sensitivity in society in general. And there's three very important concepts that people must understand. And it's not very easy, but it's difficult for people to implement this. The first is impairment. We referred to that earlier. Impairment is a perceived or actual feature in my body or a person's body or its functioning that may result in a limitation or a loss of activity, restricted participation. But people find it difficult to accept the fact of impairment. Some people don't use that word. They have other names they call this. Legally, you must have an impairment first. And people find it difficult to understand that. Secondly, who are persons with disabilities then? If impairment is not a disability, who are persons with disabilities then? And then our policy is clear by stating that this includes those who have a perceived or actual, in our case, sensory impairments, which as a result of, and that's the important thing, various barriers. First, the policy is clear about attitudinal barriers, communication barriers, physical barriers, and information barriers that hinder a person to participate fully and effectively in society. So our concerns is that people do not necessarily understand the barriers. What is the information barriers, the physical barriers, and the communication barriers that we face? Some people think, okay, hearing loss is only communication barriers. That's not true. There's physical barriers that is an obstacle. Poor acoustics, bad lighting in the workplace, for example, is a major physical barrier. So, yes, we sensitize people to understand that a person with a disability is imposed by society due to inaccessibility, as mentioned earlier. And then, of course, why are we talking about these issues? Why are we talking about functional reporting? To put our persons with hearing impairment or deafness like myself in a position to be able to negotiate for reasonable accommodations. Now, what is reasonable accommodations? Is necessary and appropriate modifications that must be made or adjustments that can be made in a workplace or in a tertiary education, but also about assistive devices and technology. But if we are not sure what's the difference between a modification and an adjustment, and our reporting is not in line with the difference about what's the difference between assistive devices and technology. Is this neck loop that I'm using technology or is this assistive devices? And as our reporting reflect that, so that people can understand that family can understand it, that employers can understand it, and then also that we as persons with a hearing impairment or deafness can understand that. But reasonable accommodation is not forced accommodation. It is not imposing a situation. That's what legislation uses. So it's about reasonability, reasonable for the employer, for example, reasonable for the individual. So it's not a forced accommodation. And that is what negotiation is so important. So if we do not have the right functional report, we cannot negotiate objectively and reasonably so that we can have equal access in the workplace.
It's so enlightening. Thank you. Fanie, what constitutes a permanent disability?
That is a big question. This is a challenge because somebody must make the call. I receive many phone calls and people ask me, how do you know that this person is a person with a disability? So in practice, this is a very good question. Let me use the employment as an example. There are 3 basic criteria under the Employment Equity Act. In relation to disability and employment, for example, just an example. First, legislation is clear, the person must have an impairment. That is important. So if I do not like the word impairment, if I say I'm not accepting the impairment aspects, then how can you negotiate? How can we as professionals help people to negotiate? So you must first accept the impairment. So that is where the sensitization comes in. And understanding of the impairment, I must make peace with my impairment. Secondly, from a legislative point of view, the impairment must be long-term. Now, somebody must make a call, and the only person that can make the call is the health professional. So we need that feedback as persons with impairments in society, that somebody say, okay, this impairment is long-term or recurring. And then thirdly, very important in line with our topic today of functional reporting, is that the impairment must be substantially limiting. Who makes that call? Again, the health professional in cooperation with other role players. The impairment is substantially limiting if its nature, duration, or effects substantially limit a person's ability to perform essential functions of a job. As I said, when you talk about the workplace, for which the job for which he or she is being considered. But you must negotiate. And you need the feedback, you need the reporting on that issue. If the effects of the impairment are not substantially limiting, in other words, functionally limiting, even if they are a physical or mental or long-term or recurring, the person is not covered under the Act. As easy as that. Where the impairment is not evident, existing or historical information or qualified expertise, and that's what legislation prescribes, may be used to ascertain the impairment and the functional limitations. And this is where the health professional role is so important, because you are the ones that qualify in the clinical aspects. So we must just add the functional aspects in line with legislation, and then we put a person in a position where he or she can say, my impairment is substantially limiting, and I have the right, in line with my functional report, to start negotiating. And of course, there are also categories of impairments that are excluded. For example, and the legislation gives an example by saying the first category of impairments, which are so easily controlled or corrected or lessened, they have no limiting effects. For example, a person who wears spectacles, in the legislation that referred to this example, or contact lenses, does not have a disability unless, even with the spectacles or the contact lenses, the person's vision is substantially impaired. Now, the same rule is applicable as far as hearing loss is concerned. An assessment to determine whether the effects of my impairment are substantially limiting. The only place I can get that is from proper functional reporting. This must then consider if medical treatment or other devices would control or correct the impairment. The degree of my loss is so severe, the cochlear implant cannot change the fact that I'm deaf. Yes, it makes such a huge difference, but still I have the right to reasonable accommodation, and my functional reporting must reflect that. I can remember the days when I was a person with a hearing impairment with moderate to severe loss. A different set of rules in terms of reasonable accommodation was applicable at that stage. Then I lost my hearing for 25 years. And then I was a lip reader for 25 years, making use of a lip speaker. Different set of rules in terms of reasonable accommodation. And then I got the cochlear implant, and now a different set of rules is in place in terms of my reasonable accommodation, because I can function now independently under certain circumstances. So this is what makes me so happy, if we can change our approach to think beyond the hearing aid system and see what is the practical implication and the needs of persons in practice.
Fanie, absolutely. I think, just from my perspective as well, for an audiologist, for example, writing a functional report, it even is an eye-opener for you as well. When you start going through what are the type of categories you need to have a look at when you write this report, it even makes it more clear for you. This is the person that I'm dealing with, and this is the context. It involves their whole life in all of these spheres. Now, somebody might be listening and thinking, okay, great, I am inspired, I need to do functional reporting. What training, is there training options that you offer?
Yes, I just mentioned that we have two sets of training. The first is to train people with impairments, with sensory impairments, to understand themselves. I must be the first one to understand my impairment, the implications of that. Why is hearing loss a disability? What about my own disclosure? What about disability legislation? What's in it for me? What is reasonable accommodation? And where and when do I need functional reporting? So this is the one side of the coin. The other side is, of course, we have another training program, Disability Rights Awareness, Functional Report Writing, for dialogue and mediation, even litigation. The other session I refer to is a 2 CPD accredited ethic points at the Health Professions Council via its university, Department of Health. And that training focuses on the practical implications and the implementation of disability rights awareness, as explained in our discussion, how to interpret terminology, and then how to implement concepts of impairments in our functional reporting. If I'm a social worker and I have a report available, how must I interpret this if I'm a social worker in the process? And then, of course, understanding the implementation of functional reporting, as we explained. It's a 2-hour training session, 2 CPD ethic points, accredited ethic points at the Health Professions Council. And this is, I believe, the way forward to share these ideas that we discussed.
Fanie, I wanted to ask you, if a child has a hearing loss, but they've been privileged enough to either receive cochlear implants or wear appropriate hearing aids and receive the necessary treatments and therapies and rehabilitation, and are able then to communicate effectively with spoken language, and they're also able to attend mainstream schooling, does this type of child still qualify for a disability grant?
If a person is a child with a hearing impaired or an adult, and we talk about the definition and the impact, then we look reasonable accommodation, because this is reasonable accommodation. And we look at the situation. In this specific case, we deal with the Social Assistance Act of 2001. Now, the definition for disability, for example, is a moderate to severe limitation. Again, somebody must make that call. Is there a moderate to severe limitation of a person's ability, and then to function or perform daily activities as a result of communication, sensory, etc. So I mentioned earlier, a mild hearing loss may be a moderate functional limitation, depending on the situation. So to answer your question, first, we must familiarize ourselves with the Social Assistance Act when we do reporting. And the person that makes a decision must familiarize him or herself with that as well. But now the situation in our country is there's no consistency in that. So you find that the person in a wheelchair is dealt in a different way than the person with an invisible impairment like psychosocial impairments or hearing loss. And this is unfair. So the implementation is the problem. It's not the legislation that's a problem. It's the reporting and the knowledge of the role players about what is meant by that legislation to make that available. That is where the problem. And I think it's easy to change that. It's just training the people that must make the decision. But to tick a box without understanding the functional impact is not going to solve the problem. And this is a situation at the moment, and we're very much concerned about that. And it's not an issue of that information is not available, but people is not communicating with each other. And that's why this issue of grants is not being dealt in all respect in a fair way in our country.
It's fascinating. And the more we delve into all the challenges around audiology and hearing loss and hearing impairment and disability, the more we find ourselves needing to learn more and more as we go along. So my last question to you, Fanie, would be, and it's no offense taken and no offense intended at all. What are we as audiologists lacking in our clinical knowledge, in our skill set, in our undergraduate training? What are we lacking that is so desperately needed in order for us to be able to report on functional disability?
My response comes from the right place, because I've been working with audiologists for the past 36 years. You are very precious to me. I mean, it wasn't for audiologists and speech therapy. Yeah, I can just think what would happen to me. But our experience from a professional point of view in practice is two major challenges that we see in this regard. The first, there is sometimes an uncertainty about who and what decides whether someone has a disability or a hearing disability. In other words, what is hearing disability? What does it mean? And who made the call when? Using, as mentioned earlier, for example, a fixed degree of hearing loss, say 30 to 40 decibels, as the criteria to define disabling hearing loss can deprive many persons with hearing impairment of the opportunity to negotiate for reasonable accommodation, because we cannot work with a fixed definition. You've mentioned that earlier, but that we see also in practice. Even international institutions use the medical model and say this is a cutoff 40, 35 or 40 decibels. It's unfair. It's not right, because we must look at the functional implications of that impairment, the situation applicable to that specific person. A hearing disability is not only about, as we agree, about the degree of hearing loss. You mentioned that earlier, as what some role players do. For example, for affirmative action in the workplace. Functional reporting must address issues beyond the hearing device. And if we can change that, this is a weakness in terms of our perspective. And this is also why the prevalence of disabling hearing loss, a hearing disability, is therefore much higher than in South Africa than is stated in some reports and similar statistics, because we wait for 40 decibels or 35 decibels, and we're not looking at the practical implications and the impact on that person. So when an impairment is permanent or substantially limiting, the individual may negotiate. And if we do that wrong, we take away opportunity for reasonable accommodation. And that is my message. Our systems must be so that we don't take away opportunity for a person to fairly negotiate for his inclusion. And that's why I earlier mentioned about 25 decibels might be of moderate functional limitation, depending on situation. And the second, then this is my last response on this question, is the understanding of the difference, the real difference between the medical, so-called medical model and the social model for addressing disability. There's many models, but the medical model primarily calls for a medical or other treatment to fix the problem with the individual. And the individual other ordinary needs are not taken into account. The healthcare professional, in our opinion, are the agents of change in a medical model of the individual, and the ones who will solve the problem. And the person is left with no say in their own life. And this is why I love this PCC, the person-centered care approach of IDA Institute, because that is what we want. The social model on the other side recognize disability, that disability stems from the inability of the society to adapt and to include a diverse range of persons with different kinds of impairments. There's 5 different types of impairments. We are the sensory group. Disability is, as I mentioned, imposed by society on these people. While there may still be a requirement for medical treatment, of course. I mean, if it wasn't for medical treatment in my situation with a cochlear implant, yes, like I can't think what would happen. So we don't say away with the medical treatment. This model, the social model, places the emphasis on the society, by saying the society is the disabling factor, with the individual with an impairment playing an active role in decision-making in all aspects of our life. So every day, activities take the center stage, and the barriers placed in society, be attitudinal, communication, physical, information, barriers which exclude persons with impairments from participating equally, are the true disabling factors. And it's you as a health professional, together with us in the disability sector, and persons with disabilities and families, that can address this together as a forum, because together we're strong. So if we can get that right, your question, that we can sensitize everybody in terms of the practical implications and change away from the medical approach more to a social approach in our report writing, that will be the difference, giving us a fair chance.
Thank you, Fanie. You are so passionate when you talk. I really enjoy talking to you and learning from you. It's a lot for an audiologist to learn from their patients, and it's about time, because we can assess and we can diagnose and we can recommend treatment, but we won't necessarily know what limitations you experience in your everyday life. And it is a pleasure for us, and it's an honor for us to have someone who has a hearing loss and who has cochlear implants to also be advocating for the rest of the profession and the rest of the community, the hearing impaired community, the public. So thank you so much for your time today, and I can't wait for the next step. We will definitely be rolling out some training for members and even non-members in the upcoming months. There's a lot that happens towards the end of the year. So a lot of congresses and a lot of webinars, and then December's always short and it's always our busiest time. So most likely early 2023, we will kick off for our first training session with APPF. And we'll take NCPD and APPF and IDA Institute to the next height.
We must be patient, and we must take it step by step. And I think if we change the culture and understand the needs of all, and why we need that topic today, the philosophy, why we need the approach of more functional reporting, if everybody understands the why, then it becomes more clear. It's not because legislation says so. I refer to legislation. We must ask the question, is it the right thing to do? And honestly, I believe that more and more practical information, an understanding of a whole case is the right thing to do. It's not pointing fingers or accusing anybody or saying now the reports that audiologists writing is wrong. It's not about right and wrong. It's how we utilize the information that's on the table, the best to the interest of the individual that need it. That might be in the retirement center, an older person. It might be tertiary education, but be in the family context, that my family must get some sort of functional reporting so that they can understand, why is it possible for me to hear somebody knock at the door, but not when a doorbell rings? This is the practical issue. And I know I've got so much respect for audiologists that do so much to address this issue. Our approach is more the formal thing that we have in writing in our hand to negotiate. So I'm so happy, and I'll just say it's an honor for me to be part of the system as an education practitioner, but also as a cochlear implantee. I honor you for that.
Thank you so much, Fanie, and we look forward to the next step, and have yourself a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Do you say
well? Okay, bye-bye.